The sound of my son's laughter still echoes in my ears, but not the kind that warms an old man's heart. At 81 years old, I've learned to distinguish between different types of laughter, and Eric's had turned cruel somewhere along the way. My name is Harold Whitman, and for 43 years I built things that mattered in this corner of Alabama. Hospitals where babies took their first breath, schools where children learned to read, bridges that connected families across Mobile Bay. I was the kind of structural engineer who signed his name on blueprints, knowing they'd outlast him by decades. That signature meant something in Fairhope, meant integrity, meant quality work done right the first time. The lakeside house where I'm sitting now, watching the sunset paint the water gold, I built with these same hands that once drafted plans for Fairhope Municipal Hospital. Every beam, every joint, every nail placed with the precision that comes from understanding how things hold together under pressure. Funny how structures can be so much more reliable than the people who live in them. Yesterday's family barbecue started pleasant enough. Eric brought Monica and my granddaughter Lily over to the house. Our house, though I notice Monica's eyes doing that calculating sweep she does when she thinks I'm not looking. At 48, my son carries himself like a financial consultant should, all pressed shirts and confident handshakes, but there's something hollow behind it now. 10 years since his mother passed, and somehow Eric's grown harder instead of softer with grief. Dad's telling those old construction stories again, Eric said to Monica while I was right there, flipping burgers on the Weber grill I'd bought to celebrate his high school graduation 30 years ago. Remember when everything was about building this and engineering that? Must be nice to live in the past. Monica laughed at that brittle sound she makes when she thinks she's being clever. Harold, you've had your time, she said, adjusting the designer sunglasses I knew cost more than my monthly grocery budget. You've got nothing left to offer except those old stories. The spatula went still in my hand. 43 years of 12-hour days of missing Little League games to finish hospital wings ahead of schedule, of putting Eric through Auburn's engineering program and then business school when he decided building things wasn't prestigious enough, the down payment on his first house. The car loan I co-signed when his credit was shaky, Christmas after Christmas when I played Santa Claus with money that should have stayed in my savings account. Eric chuckled. That's what cut deepest. Not disagreeing, just chuckling along like she'd made a perfectly reasonable observation about the weather. Dad, you've got to understand, it's a different world now. All that old school stuff doesn't really apply anymore. I turned back to the grill, nodding like I agreed, because that's what you do when you're 81 and supposedly losing relevance with each passing day. But inside, something shifted, like when you're inspecting a foundation and notice the first hairline crack, nothing dramatic, just a small sign that everything isn't as solid as it appears. Lily, bless her 17-year-old heart, tried to change the subject by asking about the old photo albums. She's the one bright spot in this family. Still curious about her grandfather's stories. Still treating me like I have something worth saying. But even she seemed uncomfortable with the tension building around the picnic table. I'd built myself from Alabama oak. That evening after they'd gone home to their pristine subdivision house, I sat in my leather recliner, the same one I'd bought to celebrate my retirement, and looked through the mail. Bills from doctors I couldn't remember seeing. Statements from insurance companies using language designed to confuse old men like me. And tucked between the medical paperwork and grocery store circulars, a letter from Regions Bank that I almost threw away unopened. Almost. The letter mentioned an account I'd forgotten about, established back in '98 during the good years when engineering contracts were plentiful and the future seemed secure. Something about dormant funds requiring attention, standard bank language that usually means they want to charge you fees for having money they're not actively managing. But as I reread it, a memory surfaced. Margaret had insisted I set up that trust account, said we needed something separate from our regular savings, something Eric couldn't touch even if we both passed. Harold, she'd said, in that voice she used when discussing serious matters, sometimes the people we love most need protecting from themselves. I called Lily that night, just to hear a friendly voice. Grandpa? She answered, on the second ring. Is everything okay? You sound different. Different. Maybe that's what happens when you realize you've been playing the harmless old man for so long, You almost forgot you were once Harold Whitman, the engineer who solved problems other people couldn't crack. The man who built things designed to last. The next morning brought a foreclosure notice in my mailbox. Not for me, thank God, but clearly misdirected mail for someone on Magnolia Avenue instead of my Magnolia Street address. Simple mistake happens all the time in a town like Fairhope, where street names echo each other. But holding that notice, seeing how quickly a family could lose everything they'd worked for, triggered something I hadn't felt in years. Suspicion. Eric called on a Tuesday morning with news that should have made me happy. "Dad, we've got some exciting developments," he said in that consultant voice he uses when he's about to sell you something. "Monica and I are finally building our dream house out near Point Clear. Custom job. Really going to be something special." I'd been drinking coffee on my back deck, watching the morning mist rise off Mobile Bay the way I had for 20 years since retirement. The same ritual, the same peace, the same sense that this house, my house, was exactly where I belonged. Should have known that peace wouldn't last. "That's wonderful, son," I said, meaning it. "About time you two got exactly what you wanted," and I did mean it, though something in his tone suggested there was more coming. "Here's the thing, Dad. Construction's going to take about 6 months, maybe longer with permit delays and all that. We thought, well, Monica had this great idea. What if we stayed with you while the house gets built? You've got all this space just going to waste, and it would give us a chance to spend real time together. Quality family time. Quality family time." I looked around at my living room, arranged exactly the way Margaret and I had liked it. Her reading chair still by the window, my engineering books still neatly shelved. The old console television we'd bought to watch Walter Cronkite, now mostly tuned to classic movie channels. Everything in its place, everything comfortable and familiar. Of course, I heard myself saying, family should stick together. They moved in that weekend with enough stuff to stock a department store. Monica directed the movers like a general deploying troops, pointing out exactly where everything should go in what she kept calling our temporary space. My guest bedroom became their master suite. Lily's old room got converted into Monica's office. The formal dining room I'd used maybe 6 times a year became their entertainment center. By the second week, my leather recliner had disappeared. "Oh, Harold," Monica said when I asked about it, "that old thing was falling apart. We had it hauled away. This new sectional is so much better for family movie nights." The sectional was white leather, the kind that shows every mark, clearly not designed for an 81-year-old man who occasionally spilled coffee or dozed off watching the Andy Griffith Show. My television viewing habits became a source of constant amusement. "Dad, you're watching black and white shows again," Eric would say, reaching for the remote. "Let me find you something with some color, some action. This old stuff is just depressing." What they called depressing, I called familiar. Jimmy Stewart and Gary Cooper knew how to play men who stood for something, who kept their word, who faced problems head-on instead of making excuses. But try explaining that to a generation raised on reality TV and action movies where buildings explode for no reason except spectacle. The changes came in waves. My morning coffee routine got disrupted when Monica bought a fancy espresso machine that took up half the counter space. "You'll love this, Harold. No more of that instant coffee nonsense. The coffee tasted fine, I suppose, but it took 15 minutes and sounded like a construction site every morning at 6 a.m. My workshop in the garage became storage for their excess furniture. "Just temporarily, Dad," Eric assured me while directing the movers to stack boxes where my workbench used to be. "Once the new house is done, we'll clear all this out." The workbench where I'd repaired everything from broken chair legs to Lily's bicycle, where I'd built the birdhouses that still dotted the backyard, now inaccessible behind towers of labeled boxes. The final straw came when I couldn't find Buster, my 12-year-old beagle who'd been my constant companion since Margaret passed. "Oh, Harold," Monica said, with that sympathetic expression she practiced in mirrors, "Buster was having such trouble adjusting to all the activity. We found him a wonderful place at the county shelter. They specialize in senior dogs. He'll be much happier there." Buster, who'd slept at the foot of my bed every night for a decade, who knew the sound of my truck and waited by the door whenever I ran errands, who'd been the one living thing in the house that still seemed genuinely happy to see me, gone to a shelter because he was having trouble adjusting. That evening, Monica posted pictures on her Facebook page, professional-looking photos of our beautiful lakeside retreat, with captions about family togetherness and making memories. In every shot, the house looked perfect. Her decorating, her furniture, her vision of what the space should be. I appeared in exactly none of them. I started noticing other changes. My filing cabinet in the den, where I kept important papers, had been moved to the basement. More space for the new entertainment center, Eric explained. When I went downstairs to retrieve some documents, I found the cabinet locked with a padlock I didn't recognize. Eric, I said, I need to get into my files. Do you know where the key is? He looked uncomfortable, which was unusual for a man who made his living being confidently in control of financial situations. Dad, Monica organized all that stuff. She said there were mice getting into the papers down there. Health hazard, you know. Everything important is locked up safe until we can go through it properly. Until we can go through it properly. Not until I can go through my own papers, but until we, meaning Eric and Monica, decided what was important in my own documents, in my own house, in my own life. That night, unable to sleep in my own bedroom, now relegated to a small guest room that had once been Margaret's sewing room, I heard voices from the kitchen. Monica's voice, sharp and clear through the thin walls. Once we get control of that account, we're done babysitting. 6 months maximum, and then we'll have options. Eric's response was too quiet to make out, but Monica's laughter carried perfectly. The same brittle sound from the barbecue. But now it was happening in my own kitchen, in the house I'd built, about affairs I apparently no longer controlled. Control of that account. Which account? And babysitting. I lay there in Margaret's sewing room, staring at the ceiling I'd installed myself 40 years ago, and felt something I hadn't experienced since the war. The cold recognition that I was surrounded by people who viewed me as an obstacle rather than an ally. Dr. Patricia Hendricks had been my physician for 15 years, ever since old Dr. Morrison retired. A competent woman, though she had a tendency to talk too loudly, like all younger people assume old folks are deaf. So when Eric suggested I see someone Monica knows for a second opinion about my occasional forgetfulness, I should have been suspicious. Dr. Samuel Garrett practiced out of a strip mall office between a nail salon and a tax preparation service. Not exactly the prestigious medical building where Dr. Hendricks worked, but Monica assured me he was cutting edge and specialized in geriatric cognitive issues. The waiting room smelled like industrial disinfectant and featured magazines from 2019. Mr. Whitman, Dr. Garrett said, barely looking up from his tablet as I settled into the examination chair. He appeared to be about 35, with the soft look of someone who'd never worked with his hands. Your family is concerned about some cognitive decline. Let's run through a few simple tests. The tests felt designed to make me fail. Questions about current events I had no interest in following. Math problems involving currency conversions for countries I'd never visited. Memory exercises using random word sequences that had no logical connection. When I mentioned that I'd prefer questions about engineering principles or local history, subjects where my mind remained sharp as ever, Dr. Garrett smiled condescendingly. That's exactly what we'd expect to see with early-stage cognitive impairment, he said, making notes on his tablet. Patients often retreat to familiar subject areas while losing capacity in other domains. Very typical pattern for someone your age. Someone my age. As if turning 81 automatically meant my brain had become unreliable machinery. Within a week, Eric had papers for me to sign. Just some standard documentation, Dad, he said, spreading them across my kitchen table, the same oak table I'd built when he was in high school. Dr. Garrett thinks it would be wise to streamline some of your decision-making processes. Take the pressure off you for the complicated financial stuff. The papers were thick with legal language, but certain phrases jumped out clear enough. Cognitive impairment, financial guardian, power of attorney for healthcare decisions. Documents that would essentially make Eric the administrator of my life, with Monica listed as secondary decision-maker. I don't understand the rush, I said, though I understood perfectly well. Dr. Hendricks has never mentioned any problems with my thinking. Eric exchanged a look with Monica that I was apparently meant to miss. Dad, Dr. Hendricks is old school. She doesn't stay current with the latest research on aging. Dr. Garrett uses modern diagnostic techniques. This is about protecting you and protecting your assets while you're still capable of making these decisions. While I'm still capable, the implication being that this capability was rapidly disappearing, despite the fact that I'd balanced my checkbook without error every month since 1962, still remembered the phone numbers of clients from 20 years ago, and could calculate structural load requirements in my head faster than Eric could find a calculator. But I signed the papers, not because I agreed with them, but because a structural engineer learns to recognize when a system is under stress and when it's wisest to appear compliant while you assess the real damage. Monica started hosting coffee sessions for her friends, using my living room like a showroom. "Ladies, isn't this just the perfect lakeside setting?" I'd hear her saying as I tried to read in what used to be my own space. "Harold's been so generous letting us stay here during construction. Of course, it's a lot of house for one person. Really more space than anyone his age could properly maintain." One morning, I encountered a woman I didn't recognize measuring the windows in my bedroom. "Oh, hello," she said brightly. "I'm Sarah Chen from Magnolia Realty. Monica's friend? Just getting some preliminary measurements. Nothing official, just helping out with some planning." Preliminary measurements for what? Planning for what? When I asked Monica later, she waved dismissively. "Oh, Harold, Sarah's just a friend." She was admiring the crown molding in the bedrooms. You know how real estate people are, always looking at properties with professional eyes. Professional eyes that required measuring tapes, apparently. Lily visited on a Saturday afternoon, and I found her crying in the garden behind the house where Margaret used to grow tomatoes. "Grandpa," she said when she saw me, "Mom and Dad are being horrible to you. The way they talk about you when you're not around, like you're some kind of burden they have to manage. It's disgusting." I sat beside her on the stone bench I'd built, beside Margaret's rose bushes. "Lily, your parents are just trying to help an old man who's getting forgetful." "Forgetful?" She looked at me with those sharp 17-year-old eyes that missed nothing. "Grandpa, you remembered my middle school graduation speech word for word last month. You helped me with calculus homework that Mom couldn't even understand. You're sharper than half the people in my AP classes. Smart girl, too smart for her own good in a family that preferred convenient narratives to complicated truths." "Sometimes," I said carefully, "it's better to let people believe what makes them comfortable. At least for now." She studied my face with the intensity she'd inherited from the engineering side of the family. "Grandpa, you're planning something." I was not consciously. Not yet. But the way I used to approach complex structural problems, gathering information, identifying weak points, understanding the full scope of the challenge before proposing solutions. The part of my mind that had designed buildings to withstand hurricanes was starting to engage with a different kind of structural analysis. That evening, while Eric and Monica watched television in what used to be my living room, I went down to the basement to check on my filing cabinet. Still locked, but I'd noticed something Eric probably hadn't. The hasp holding the padlock was attached with screws I recognized. Phillips head screws I'd used in a repair job 3 years ago. I knew exactly where I kept the identical screws, along with the screwdriver that fit them. But first, I wanted to see what other papers they might be examining. Hidden behind some Christmas decorations, I found a box that hadn't been there before. Inside, copies of bank statements, property deeds, insurance policies, my documents, but with calculations written in Monica's handwriting in the margins. Most interesting was a withdrawal slip from First National Bank. $40,000. Eric's signature, dated last Tuesday, from an account I hadn't accessed in months. $40,000 from an account that, according to the papers Eric had me sign, he now had legal authority to manage on my behalf. Funny thing about being a structural engineer, you learn to spot foundation problems long before the building shows obvious signs of damage. And this particular foundation, the one supporting my family's professed concern for my welfare, was showing stress fractures that ran deeper than anyone realized. Time to do what I'd always done when facing a complex engineering challenge: gather more data, consult with trusted colleagues, and design a solution that would hold up under pressure. Tuesday morning found me in my workshop, or what was left of it, behind Monica's stored furniture. I'd retrieved my old engineering notebooks from their hiding place, behind the water heater, the same notebooks where I'd calculated load-bearing requirements for the Fairhope Municipal Hospital's emergency wing back in '89. Funny how the same systematic approach that worked for 50,000-pound concrete structures might apply to family problems. First step, assess the actual structural integrity of my situation. I laid out everything I knew across my remaining workbench space like blueprints. The mysterious $40,000 withdrawal, Monica's preliminary measurements conversation with the realtor, Eric's power of attorney documents, the locked filing cabinet, Dr. Garrett's convenient diagnosis of cognitive decline. In engineering, when multiple components fail simultaneously, you don't have individual problems. You have systematic failure. This wasn't coincidence, it was coordination. Second step, consult with experienced professionals. At 81, I'd outlasted most of my contemporaries. But Fairhope was a small town where relationships ran deep as artesian wells. Some of the best minds I'd worked with were still sharp as piano wire, still willing to help an old colleague who'd never let them down on a project. My first call went to Chester Blackwood, retired president of First National Bank. We'd worked together on financing for 3 hospital expansions and the renovation of Fairhope Elementary. Chester answered on the second ring with the voice of a man who'd never learned to slow down in retirement. Harold Whitman, been wondering when you'd surface. Heard through the grapevine your boy moved back in with you. Family reunions can be complicated. Chester, I need some professional advice about banking procedures. Hypothetical situation. I'd learned long ago that presenting problems as hypothetical made people more willing to share detailed information. Shoot. Say an elderly man signs power of attorney documents after being diagnosed with cognitive impairment. How much authority would that give his son over existing accounts? Chester's silence stretched long enough that I wondered if the connection had dropped. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted from friendly to professional. Harold, that's awfully specific for a hypothetical question. You having troubles with Eric? Let's say I am. Well, power of attorney can be tricky. Depends on how the documents are written and when they were executed. But Harold, here's something your hypothetical elderly man should know. Cognitive impairment diagnosis don't automatically validate power of attorney transfer. Courts can overturn those arrangements if they suspect coercion or if the diagnosis seems questionable. Questionable diagnosis, like one performed by a strip mall doctor who'd spent 10 minutes asking irrelevant questions. Chester, hypothetically, how would someone verify the legitimacy of such a diagnosis? Independent assessment from a reputable neurologist, someone with no connection to family members, someone who understands the difference between normal aging and genuine cognitive impairment. My next call went to Margaret's cousin, retired probate attorney Julia Castellanos. Julia had handled our wills 20 years ago and possessed the kind of sharp legal mind that improved with age like good bourbon. Harold, what a pleasant surprise. How are you managing in that big house by yourself? Actually, Julia, I'm not by myself anymore. Eric and Monica moved in temporarily while their new place gets built. Which brings me to why I'm calling. I outlined the situation without naming names, framing everything as concerns about elder abuse in general. Julia listened without interruption, the way good lawyers do when they sense something significant developing. Harold, she said finally, what you're describing sounds like financial exploitation. It's more common than people realize, especially when adult children have access to elderly parents' homes and financial information. The cognitive impairment angle is particularly troubling. That's become a standard tactic for rushed power of attorney transfers. Hypothetically, what options would someone in this situation have? Well, hypothetically, that someone would need to document everything carefully. Bank records, medical records, any evidence of coercion or misrepresentation, and they'd need to act quickly. The longer these arrangements remain in place, the harder they are to challenge legally. Documentation. Evidence. The same methodical approach I'd used to prove structural calculations to building inspectors who questioned my designs. My third call went to the Fairhope Methodist Church, where I'd served as deacon for 15 years before Margaret's illness consumed my volunteer time. Pastor Williams had retired, but his replacement, Pastor Davidson, knew my reputation in the community. "Mr. Whitman, how wonderful to hear from you. We've missed seeing you at Sunday services. Pastor, I'm calling because I may need some community support for a difficult family situation. Nothing I can discuss over the phone, but I wanted to know, if push comes to shove, whether the church community would be willing to listen to concerns about elder financial abuse. Mr. Whitman, this church has always stood behind members who've contributed as much as you have to this community. Whatever you're facing, you won't face it alone." By Thursday, I was ready for the crucial meeting. Thomas Hendricks, no relation to Dr. Patricia Hendricks, though he'd been Patricia's mentor at the University of Alabama, had been my structural engineering partner for 12 years before his retirement. Now he spent his days managing a small consulting firm that specialized in expert witness testimony for construction disputes. Tom lived in the same Spanish Lakes subdivision where he'd moved 30 years ago, in a house I'd helped him design when his first grandchild was born. His workshop looked like mine used to, organized, functional, filled with tools that showed signs of regular use. "Harold, you look like a man with something heavy on his mind," Tom said, pouring coffee from a pot that probably dated to the Carter administration. "And something tells me it's not about foundation settling or load calculations." I told him everything, the whole story, from the barbecue humiliation to the mysterious bank withdrawal to Monica's real estate friend measuring my windows. Tom listened the way he used to listen to structural problem presentations. No interruptions, no premature judgments, just careful attention to details that might matter later. "Harold," he said when I finished, "you realize what you're describing, don't you? This isn't just family friction. This is systematic asset stripping. They're positioning themselves to take control of everything you've built, literally and financially, while making it look like concerned family care." That's what I suspected. The question is, what can an 81-year-old man do about it? Tom smiled the way he used to smile when we'd figured out a particularly elegant solution to a complex engineering challenge. "Harold, you're thinking about this wrong. The question isn't what an 81-year-old man can do. The question is what Harold Whitman, respected engineer, community leader, man who designed half the important buildings in Baldwin County, can do about people trying to steal his life's work." That evening, I sat in Margaret's sewing room with my engineering notebook spread across her old quilting table, not planning revenge. Revenge was emotional, impulsive, unreliable, and was designing a solution. A systematic response that would restore structural integrity to my life while protecting the assets I'd worked 43 years to accumulate. First element of the design: verify the true scope of my financial resources. That meant accessing the dormant trust account Margaret had insisted we establish, the one I'd almost forgotten about until the bank letter arrived. Second element: neutralize Eric's power of attorney through legitimate medical evaluation and legal challenge. Third element: secure my assets against further unauthorized access. Fourth element: document everything for potential legal action. I opened the bottom drawer of Margaret's sewing table and found what I was looking for: the original trust documents from 1998, hidden behind patterns for quilts she'd never had time to finish. As I read through the legal language, one detail jumped out like a surveyor's mark on a construction site. The trust required my living signature for any fund transfers. Not a power of attorney signature, not a guardian's authorization. My personal witness signature with current identification verification. Eric had legal authority over my checking account and savings, but he'd never known about the trust. And Monica's calculations in the margins of my documents had focused on the visible assets: the house, the obvious bank accounts, the insurance policies. They'd been planning to steal what they could see. They had no idea what they couldn't see. Friday morning brought the kind of crisp October weather that makes Alabama's Gulf Coast feel like paradise. Perfect conditions for what Margaret used to call important business. The kind of day when clear thinking felt as natural as breathing. I'd been awake since 5, planning my moves like a chess master working 3 steps ahead. My first stop was Regions Bank. where I'd maintained accounts for 40 years. The trust department occupied a discreet corner of the main building, staffed by professionals who understood that wealth often preferred privacy to publicity. Mrs. Eleanor Vance, trust officer, greeted me like the substantial client I apparently was. "Mr. Whitman, what a pleasure to finally meet you in person. We've been managing your trust conservatively, as specified in the original documents. The account has performed quite well over the past 25 years." Quite well turned out to be an understatement. The trust Margaret had insisted we establish with $50,000 in 1998 now contained just over $600,000, thanks to careful investment in blue-chip stocks and dividend reinvestment. Margaret's financial instincts had been better than I'd realized. "Mrs. Vance, I need to understand my options regarding this account. My family situation has become complicated, and I want to ensure these funds remain secure." She reviewed the trust documents with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen family money disputes destroy relationships. "Mr. Whitman, this trust is ironclad. No one except you can authorize withdrawals or transfers. The beneficiary designation can only be changed with your written consent, witnessed by 2 bank officers. It's one of the most secure arrangements I've encountered." Secure. The word Margaret had insisted on when we'd argued about wasting money on legal fees for a trust we might never need. As usual, she'd been thinking further ahead than I had. My next appointment was with Judge Patricia Moorhead, who'd been practicing family law when I was building her office complex 30 years ago. Now retired from the bench, she maintained a small practice handling estate disputes and elder law cases. Her office still displayed the architectural drawings I'd prepared for her building, a reminder of the days when I'd been Harold Whitman, the respected professional, not Harold Whitman, the confused old man. "Harold, what brings you to see me? Please don't tell me you're having problems with foundations settling. That building's solid as Gibraltar." "Different kind of foundation problem, Patricia." "Family foundation." I outlined the situation with the careful precision I'd once used to describe structural specifications. Patricia took notes in the same meticulous handwriting she'd used for judicial opinions, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed her sharp understanding of elder exploitation tactics. "Harold, what you're describing follows a classic pattern. Financial abuse of elderly parents often begins with manufactured health concerns, proceeds to isolation and control, and culminates in asset transfer. The timeline you've described, from the BBQ incident to the power of attorney signing, is textbook psychological manipulation. Can it be reversed? Absolutely, if we can demonstrate that the cognitive impairment diagnosis was fraudulent or coercive. I have contacts at University of Alabama Hospital's neurology department. Dr. James Patterson specializes in capacity assessments for legal proceedings. He's testified in dozens of elder abuse cases. She made a phone call while I waited, speaking in the professional shorthand lawyers use when discussing serious legal matters. When she hung up, her expression was businesslike but encouraging. "Dr. Patterson can see you Monday morning for a comprehensive evaluation. Harold, if he finds no evidence of cognitive impairment, which I suspect he won't, we can file to void the power of attorney documents and potentially pursue criminal charges for financial exploitation." Criminal charges. The phrase carried weight I hadn't fully considered. Eric wasn't just being ungrateful or impatient. He was potentially committing felony theft. Saturday brought an unexpected visitor. Billy Crawford had been my apprentice engineer back in the 80s, a sharp young man who'd learned structural design under my supervision before starting his own firm. Now, at 55, Billy was one of the most respected commercial architects in Mobile County. He'd driven over from Spanish Fort after hearing through professional networks that I might be having family troubles. "Mr. Whitman," Billy said, settling into the chair that used to be my leather recliner, now replaced by Monica's white sectional, "word gets around in our business when one of the giants needs support. You taught half the engineers in Baldwin County. We don't forget that." Giants. The word caught me off guard. I hadn't thought of myself as a giant in years, just an old man trying to stay out of the way. "Billy, I appreciate the sentiment, but I'm not sure how much fight I have left in me." "Mr. Whitman, do you remember what you told me the first day I worked for you? You said, Billy, engineering isn't about building things that look good. It's about building things that last longer than the people who built them. Well, sir, your reputation has lasted. Your buildings are still standing. And the people you trained are still using what you taught them. He pulled out a folder containing photographs. These are some of the projects your former apprentices have completed in the past 5 years. Schools, hospitals, government buildings across 3 states, all using structural principles we learned from you. All signed by engineers who consider themselves part of the Harold Whitman legacy. Legacy. Another word that had gotten lost somewhere between Dr. Garrett's cognitive tests and Monica's furniture rearrangement. Billy, I need to ask you something. If this situation goes public, if there's legal action against Eric, will that damage the professional reputation I spent 43 years building? Billy's expression grew serious. Mr. Whitman, elder financial abuse happens to strong, intelligent people. It's not a reflection of weakness or mental decline. It's exploitation by people who pretend to care while they steal everything their victims worked for. Any engineer who'd think less of you for fighting back isn't worth your concern. That evening, Lily called, asking if she could visit Sunday afternoon. I need to talk to you, Grandpa. Away from Mom and Dad. There are things you need to know about what they're planning. Things I need to know. From a 17-year-old who was apparently more aware of her parents' schemes than I'd been until recently. Sunday morning, I attended church for the first time in months. Pastor Davidson's sermon dealt with David facing Goliath. Appropriate, though I wondered if he'd selected the topic knowing about my situation. Probably not. Small-town pastors were good at sensing congregational needs without necessarily knowing specific details. After service, something remarkable happened. People approached me, people I'd worked with, people I'd helped over the years, people who remembered when Harold Whitman's signature on a blueprint meant something in this community. They didn't know about Eric and Monica, but they sensed something was wrong. Harold, said Martha Stevens, whose son I'd mentored through engineering school 15 years ago, we've missed seeing you around town. If you need anything, anything at all, you call us. Similar offers came from Tom Hendricks, from Billy Crawford, from Chester Blackwood, from 3 other retired engineers, from the church secretary, from my former next-door neighbor who'd moved to a retirement community, but still drove back to Fairhope every Sunday for worship. A quiet army of people who remembered when I'd been more than just Eric's inconvenient father. That afternoon, Lily arrived, looking troubled but determined. She'd inherited the analytical mind that ran in our family. Margaret's sharp intelligence, combined with the systematic thinking I'd tried to teach Eric, but had apparently skipped a generation. Grandpa, Mom and Dad don't know I'm here. They think I'm at Sarah's house studying, but I overheard them talking last night, and you need to know what they said. She pulled out her phone, showing me text messages between Eric and someone named Jim, presumably a business associate. The messages discussed liquidating the old man's assets and fast-tracking the property transfer before he realizes what's happening. One text was particularly revealing. Doctor says cognitive decline diagnosis will hold up in court if anyone challenges it. Just need to maintain documentation showing he can't manage finances independently. Grandpa, Lily said, they're not building a new house. Dad looked at properties, but he never made an offer on anything. The 6-month timeline was just to give them time to transfer everything into their names legally. I stared at the text messages, feeling the same cold fury I'd experienced during the war when I'd discovered that a supply sergeant was selling medical supplies meant for wounded soldiers. Calculated betrayal by people who'd sworn loyalty. Lily, I need you to do something for me. Don't let them know you told me any of this. Can you manage that? Of course, Grandpa. But what are you going to do? I looked out at Mobile Bay, where the afternoon light was painting the water the same gold I'd watched for 20 years from this house I'd built with my own hands. The house Eric and Monica planned to sell before I was cold in the ground. What I should have done weeks ago, sweetheart. I'm going to remind them that Harold Whitman didn't get where he is by letting people steal what he worked for. Monday morning at University of Alabama Hospital's neurology department felt like preparing for the most important structural inspection of my career. Dr. James Patterson was nothing like Dr. Garrett, board-certified, university-affiliated, with 30 years of experience distinguishing between genuine cognitive decline and normal aging processes. The evaluation took 3 hours. Memory tests that made sense, focusing on recent events, practical problem solving, and sequential reasoning. Mathematical problems that actually challenged cognitive function rather than testing irrelevant trivia. Most importantly, questions about my professional background that allowed me to demonstrate the kind of complex analytical thinking that had defined my career. Mr. Whitman, Dr. Patterson said as he reviewed his notes, whoever diagnosed you with cognitive impairment was either incompetent or dishonest. Your cognitive function tests above average for your age group. Your memory is excellent, your reasoning ability is sharp, and your capacity for managing complex financial decisions is clearly intact. He handed me a detailed written report, with his official letterhead and medical license number clearly displayed. This document states unequivocally that you have full capacity for making financial and healthcare decisions. Any power of attorney arrangements based on claims of cognitive impairment are medically unjustified. Medical ammunition for the legal battle Judge Moorhead was preparing. Tuesday, I met with Mrs. Vance at Regions Bank to authorize several strategic moves. First, I changed the beneficiary on the trust account from Eric to Lily, with documentation that would prevent any challenge to the designation. Second, I arranged for all account statements to be mailed to Tom Hendricks's address instead of my home, preventing Monica from intercepting financial communications. Most importantly, I established a fraud alert on all my accounts, requiring in-person identification verification for any major transactions. Eric's power of attorney was about to become worthless paper. Mr. Whitman, Mrs. Vance said as she processed the changes. These are smart protective measures. Unfortunately, we see family financial abuse more often than people realize. Usually by the time elderly clients seek help, significant damage has already been done. You're fortunate to have caught this early. Early, though it hadn't felt early when I'd been sitting in Margaret's sewing room wondering if I'd become the incompetent old man everyone seemed to think I was. Wednesday brought legal action. Judge Moorhead filed papers with Baldwin County Probate Court, formally challenging Eric's power of attorney on grounds of fraud and coercion. She also filed a restraining order preventing any further financial transactions, using the disputed authorization. The process server would deliver both documents to Eric at his office Thursday afternoon. Maximum professional embarrassment for a financial consultant who'd built his reputation on trustworthy handling of clients' assets. Thursday evening, I was reading in Margaret's sewing room when I heard Eric's truck pull into the driveway with more aggressive acceleration than usual. Voices in the kitchen quickly escalated from discussion to argument to something approaching shouting. How the hell did he get independent legal representation? Monica's voice carried clearly through the thin walls. I thought you said the old man was barely functional. The medical evaluation was supposed to be definitive, Eric replied. Dr. Garrett assured me. Well, Dr. Garrett's evaluation just got contradicted by a university neurologist, and now there's a court order freezing your power of attorney, pending investigation. Investigation, Eric. Do you understand what that means for your business if this goes public? What it meant was exactly what Judge Moorhead had predicted. Financial consultants who couldn't manage their own family affairs without court intervention weren't likely to inspire client confidence. Friday morning, Eric's credit card was declined at Murphy's Hardware when he tried to purchase new locks for the house, presumably to prevent me from accessing areas they'd claimed were being organized for my safety. By afternoon, the real estate deal Monica had quietly arranged fell apart when the title search revealed the court order preventing property transfers. Monica's reaction was predictable but still satisfying to witness. This is insane, she screamed at Eric while I pretended to nap in my corner of the living room. We've put 6 months into this plan, and now some judge is treating us like common criminals. Common criminals. Sometimes people reveal more truth in anger than in careful conversation. Saturday brought the piece de resistance. Judge Moorhead had arranged for a private investigator to document Eric and Monica's activities, particularly their communications about liquidating the old man's assets. Alabama law takes elder financial abuse seriously, and evidence of conspiracy to defraud constitutes felony criminal behavior. The investigator, A woman named Carol Lynch, who specialized in family financial crimes, had been monitoring their communications and documenting their activities for 2 weeks. Her report made fascinating reading. Detailed records of unauthorized bank withdrawals, documentation of the fake medical evaluation, photographs of Monica meeting with real estate agents, transcripts of phone conversations discussing property sale timelines. Most damaging was a recorded conversation between Eric and Monica, discussing how to maintain the cognitive decline story. If anyone questioned Dr. Garrett's diagnosis, clear evidence of conspiracy to commit fraud. Sunday morning, I sat in my regular pew at Fairhope Methodist Church, wearing the same suit I'd worn to deacon meetings for 15 years. Pastor Davidson had asked me to share some thoughts about community and family during the service, presumably without knowing about the legal drama unfolding in my personal life. What I shared was simple. Sometimes the people we trust most test that trust in ways we never expected. When that happens, we have a choice between accepting betrayal as inevitable or standing up for principles that matter more than family harmony. I've learned this week that community support can be stronger than family obligation, and that respect earned over decades doesn't disappear just because someone tries to convince you it never existed. The congregation responded with an enthusiasm I hadn't experienced in years. These weren't just church members being polite to an elderly parishioner. These were people who remembered when Harold Whitman's word meant something in this community. After service, Tom Hendricks approached with an envelope. "Harold, this arrived at my office yesterday. Thought you should see it immediately." The envelope contained a cease and desist letter from Monica's attorney. Apparently, she'd hired legal representation to challenge the court orders. The letter threatened counter-litigation for defamation and interfering with family healthcare decisions. I handed the letter back to Tom with a smile I hadn't felt in months. "Tom, do you remember what we used to tell clients who threatened to sue us for structural designs that didn't meet their preferences? We used to tell them that solid engineering work stands up to any scrutiny, and that threatening lawsuits usually meant they knew they didn't have a legitimate case." Exactly. Monica's lawyer is betting I'll back down rather than face public embarrassment. But here's what she doesn't understand. I'm 81 years old. I built half the important structures in this county, and I've got nothing left to lose except what people are already trying to steal from me. That evening, Lily visited with news that Monica had become increasingly desperate. "She's been on the phone all day, Grandpa. Calling lawyers, calling Dr. Garrett, calling people I don't recognize. And she's been packing things like she's getting ready to leave." Getting ready to leave made sense. Once the criminal investigation began in earnest, staying in Baldwin County would become uncomfortable for people who'd made their living on reputation and trustworthy behavior. "Lily, I need you to know that whatever happens next, none of this is your fault. You've been the one bright spot in this whole mess." She hugged me with the fierce loyalty 17-year-old granddaughters reserve for grandfathers, who've always treated them like intelligent human beings rather than decorative children. "Grandpa, are you going to be okay when this is all over?" I looked around the living room Monica had redecorated, imagining it restored to the comfortable arrangement Margaret and I had preferred. My leather recliner back in its place by the window. My television tuned to classic movies. My workshop cleared of stored furniture and returned to its intended purpose. "Sweetheart, I'm going to be better than okay. I'm going to be exactly where I belong, surrounded by people who remember that Harold Whitman built things designed to last." Baldwin County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in November felt like stepping back into professional respectability. I testified in this building dozens of times over the years, expert witness on structural failures, consultant on construction disputes, the engineer whose opinion carried weight because 43 years of solid work earned that kind of credibility. Today felt different. Today I wasn't Harold Whitman, the expert witness. I was Harold Whitman, the victim of financial exploitation, fighting to reclaim assets people assumed I was too old and confused to protect. But as I walked through the courthouse doors, I realized I wasn't walking alone. Tom Hendricks had driven me to the hearing, but the parking lot revealed a gathering I hadn't expected. Billy Crawford's truck, Chester Blackwood's Cadillac, Pastor Davidson's ministerial sedan, cars belonging to people I'd worked with, taught, mentored, and served alongside for decades. Word had spread through Fairhope's professional community that Harold Whitman needed support, and support had materialized. Judge Sarah Morrison, no relation to my old doctor, but someone whose father had been a construction foreman on 3 projects I'd supervised, presided over a courtroom that buzzed with quiet conversation. The gallery was packed with faces I recognized. Retired engineers, former church members, business associates, even 3 former apprentices who'd driven from Mobile and Montgomery to witness the proceedings. Eric sat at the respondent's table with his attorney, a sharp-dressed young man from Mobile who specialized in defending financial professionals against regulatory complaints. Monica occupied the first row behind them, her designer clothing carefully selected to project victim status rather than the calculating manipulation she'd displayed at home. Judge Moorhead presented our case with the methodical precision of someone who'd spent 30 years dealing with family financial disputes. Dr. Patterson's cognitive evaluation, bank records showing unauthorized withdrawals, the private investigator's documentation of conspiracy conversations, Dr. Garrett's qualifications, or lack thereof, for making cognitive assessments. Most damaging was the recording Carol Lynch had obtained of Monica discussing timeline acceleration for asset liquidation before I figured out what was happening. Clear evidence that they'd known their actions were unauthorized and had deliberately moved to complete the theft before discovery. Eric's attorney attempted several defense strategies. Claims that I'd been genuinely confused about financial matters. Assertions that Eric had been acting in my best interests. Arguments that family members often needed to make difficult decisions for elderly parents who couldn't acknowledge their own limitations. Every argument fell apart under scrutiny. Dr. Patterson's evaluation demolished claims of cognitive impairment. Bank records showed systematic withdrawal patterns inconsistent with legitimate health care or maintenance expenses. Most importantly, Eric couldn't explain why protecting my assets required hiding financial information from me while making unauthorized transfers to accounts I couldn't access. When Judge Morrison asked if I wanted to address the court, I stood with the same confidence I'd once brought to structural analysis presentations. 81 years old, but still Harold Whitman, the engineer whose professional opinion had guided millions of dollars in construction projects. Your Honor, I spent 43 years building structures designed to withstand pressure, weather, and time. I signed blueprints knowing they'd outlast me, knowing other people's safety depended on getting the calculations right. That kind of responsibility teaches you to distinguish between genuine problems and manufactured crises. I gestured toward Eric and Monica. These people manufactured a crisis. They hired a questionable doctor to manufacture a diagnosis. They manufactured urgency around financial decisions that didn't require urgency. They manufactured concern for my welfare while systematically stealing resources I'd worked decades to accumulate. The courtroom was silent except for the court reporter's typing. Your Honor, I'm not asking for sympathy because I'm 81 years old. I'm asking for justice because Harold Whitman, engineer, community member, taxpayer, church deacon, deserves the same legal protection as any other citizen whose family members try to steal his life's work. Judge Morrison's ruling was swift and comprehensive. Eric's power of attorney was declared null and void, obtained through fraudulent medical representation. All financial transfers made under that authority were ordered reversed within 30 days. Monica was prohibited from making any further representations about my mental capacity without independent medical verification. Most satisfying was the judge's commentary. This case represents a textbook example of elder financial abuse disguised as family concern. The evidence shows systematic exploitation of trust, deliberate deception about medical conditions, and conspiracy to defraud. While this proceeding addresses civil remedies, the court strongly recommends that the district attorney's office review this matter for potential criminal prosecution. Criminal prosecution. Words that carried implications Eric couldn't escape through charm or professional reputation. As we left the courtroom, people approached to offer congratulations and support. Not the sympathetic condolences you'd expect for an elderly man who'd been victimized, but the respectful acknowledgement you'd show a professional who'd successfully defended his reputation against unfair attack. "Harold," said Martha Stevens, the church secretary who'd known me for 20 years, We always knew you were too sharp for anyone to pull a fast one on you. Just took you a while to realize what was happening. Chester Blackwood was more direct. Harold, word's gonna get around about this. Eric's gonna have trouble maintaining clients who hear he couldn't manage his own family's finances without court intervention. Actions have consequences in this business. Outside the courthouse, Monica confronted me with the kind of desperate anger that surfaces when careful plans collapse. This isn't over, Harold. We'll appeal everything. We'll prove you manipulated everyone into believing. Monica, I interrupted, using the calm voice I'd once used to explain structural problems to panicked building contractors. The only thing you're going to prove is that Harold Whitman didn't get to be 81 years old by letting people steal what he worked for. I handed her the eviction notice. Judge Moorhead had prepared, legally served, properly documented, giving them 72 hours to vacate my property. 72 hours, I said. That should be enough time to pack everything that actually belongs to you. Eric started to protest, but his attorney, who'd apparently been calculating the professional damage from criminal prosecution recommendations, pulled him aside for urgent conversation. When they finished talking, Eric's expression had shifted from angry to desperate. "Dad," he said, the first time he'd used that word with genuine emotion in months, "maybe we can work something out. Some kind of arrangement that doesn't involve criminal charges." I finished. "Eric, that decision isn't mine anymore. It's up to the district attorney and the evidence your actions created. But I'll tell you what I told construction contractors who tried to cut corners on safety specifications. When you build something wrong, you don't get to negotiate with physics. Consequences follow actions whether you like them or not." That evening I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot, watching sunset paint Baldwin County gold. In 72 hours my house would be mine again. My workshop would be cleared of Monica's stored furniture. My leather recliner would return to its place by the window overlooking Mobile Bay. But more than that, Harold Whitman would be Harold Whitman again. Not Eric's confused father. Not Monica's inconvenient burden, but the engineer who'd built things designed to last, including a reputation solid enough to withstand family betrayal. Lily called as I was driving home. "Grandpa, Mom's been crying all day, and Dad's been on the phone with lawyers." "Is it really over?" "The legal part is over, sweetheart. The rest is just paperwork and people learning to live with decisions they made." "Are you angry with them?" I thought about that question as I pulled into the driveway of the house I'd built with my own hands. "Lily, anger is what you feel when someone disappoints you. What I feel is something different. Relief, I suppose. Relief that I remembered who Harold Whitman is before it was too late to do anything about it." Friday afternoon arrived with the kind of November clarity that makes Alabama's Gulf Coast feel like a gift from a generous God. The moving truck in my driveway carried the last of Monica's designer furniture and Eric's accumulated possessions, everything they'd moved into my house 6 months ago with promises of temporary arrangements and quality family time. I watched from my back deck as they loaded the white sectional that had replaced my leather recliner, the espresso machine that had occupied half my kitchen counter, the entertainment center that had transformed my formal dining room into their personal theater. Each piece represented an attempt to remake my life according to their preferences, their assumptions about what an 81-year-old widower needed or deserved. Eric moved with the mechanical efficiency of someone fulfilling court-ordered obligations rather than family interactions. No conversation beyond necessity. No acknowledgement that the house had been his childhood home. No recognition that every room held memories of birthdays, Christmas mornings, graduation celebrations. Just methodical loading of possessions while avoiding eye contact. Monica supervised with the brittle composure of someone maintaining dignity through public humiliation. Her designer sunglasses hid expressions, but her rigid posture and sharp directions to the movers revealed the stress of watching carefully laid plans collapse into legal consequences and professional embarrassment. When they finished loading, Eric paused at his truck door, like he wanted to say something. For a moment, I hoped for genuine acknowledgement, maybe even apology. Instead, he delivered a final attempt at face-saving. "Dad, you'll realize eventually that we were trying to help. When you're sitting here alone, When something happens that you can't handle by yourself, you'll understand what we were trying to prevent. What they were trying to prevent was Harold Whitman maintaining control of Harold Whitman's life. What they were trying to accomplish was theft, disguised as family concern. Eric, I said, using the patient tone I'd once employed when teaching apprentice engineers about structural calculations, I've been handling things by myself for 10 years since your mother passed. The only problems I couldn't handle were the ones you and Monica created. They drove away without looking back, leaving tire marks on the gravel driveway and silence that felt like liberation rather than abandonment. Within an hour, Lily appeared with cleaning supplies and the boundless energy 17-year-olds bring to projects they consider personally meaningful. Grandpa, let's get this house back to the way it's supposed to be. We started in the living room, arranging furniture the way Margaret and I had liked it, comfortable rather than stylish, functional rather than impressive. My leather recliner, rescued from storage, returned to its place by the window overlooking Mobile Bay. The television, freed from Monica's entertainment center, resumed its modest corner position. The formal dining room became formal again, with the oak table I'd built taking center stage instead of serving as Monica's staging area for real estate documents. Family photographs, removed during Monica's decluttering process, returned to mantels and side tables, restoring visual reminders that this house had been home to a marriage, a family, a lifetime of shared experiences. Most satisfying was reclaiming my workshop. Monica's stored furniture had obscured decades of organized tools, project materials, half-finished repairs that represented the ongoing relationship between a man and the house he'd built. Clearing those spaces felt like archaeological excavation, revealing layers of purposeful activity buried under months of imposed irrelevance. Grandpa, Lily said as we organized my workbench, did you always know you were going to fight back, or did it take time to decide? I considered the question while hanging familiar tools in their proper places. Lily, I think I spent months trying to convince myself that being a burden was inevitable at my age. Your parents didn't create that feeling, they just exploited it. The fighting back part happened when I realized that Harold Whitman wasn't actually a burden. He was just surrounded by people who found it convenient to treat him like one. That evening, as Lily helped me prepare dinner in a kitchen restored to comfortable functionality, the phone started ringing. Word had spread through Fairhope's interconnected community that Harold Whitman was home alone again, and people responded the way small southern towns respond to neighbors who might need support. Pastor Davidson called to invite me for coffee and catching up on church business. Martha Stevens offered to coordinate grocery shopping assistance until you're settled back into your routine. Tom Hendricks suggested weekly breakfast meetings to discuss local engineering projects that could use senior consultant input. Most touching was a call from Billy Crawford with a proposition that surprised me. Mr. Whitman, I've been thinking about something ever since the courthouse hearing. I'm working on plans for a new community center, and I'd like to bounce some structural ideas off you. Not charity consultation, professional consultation. Paid consulting work if you're interested. Professional consultation. Someone still valued Harold Whitman's engineering expertise, still considered his professional opinion worth purchasing. Billy, I'd be honored to look at your plans. Saturday brought visitors. Not the social obligation visits elderly people often endure, but the purposeful visits accorded to community members whose opinions and experiences matter. Chester Blackwood stopped by with coffee and financial documents, not to check on my mental capacity, but to discuss investment strategies for the trust fund Eric and Monica had never discovered. Judge Moorhead arrived with legal papers requiring my signature, documents establishing the Harold and Margaret Whitman Community Scholarship Fund, using a portion of the trust account to help local students pursue engineering education, a legacy project that would ensure our names remained associated with building and teaching rather than family legal disputes. Most significantly, Carol Lynch, the private investigator who documented Eric and Monica's conspiracy, brought news that the district attorney's office was indeed pursuing criminal charges. Financial exploitation of elderly persons carried serious penalties in Alabama, and the evidence was overwhelming. Mr. Whitman, she said, you should know that your willingness to fight back probably prevented them from victimizing other elderly people. Criminals like Eric and Monica usually have multiple targets. Your case will make it harder for them to establish credibility with future victims. Future victims. I hadn't considered that my situation might be part of a larger pattern, that my decision to resist might protect other families from similar betrayal. Sunday evening found me in my leather recliner, watching the sunset paint Mobile Bay gold, while reading engineering journals. Billy Crawford had brought publications featuring articles about sustainable construction techniques and innovative structural solutions, work that connected to everything I'd spent 43 years learning and teaching. The house felt different, not empty despite the absence of Eric and Monica's voices, but peaceful in the way structures feel when they're being used for their intended purposes. Every room arranged according to function rather than fashion, every space reflecting the preferences of people who'd chosen this house, built this house, earned the right to live in this house according to their own values and habits. I opened my desk drawer and found the envelope I'd prepared months ago. My final letter to Lily, written during the dark period when I'd believed Eric and Monica's narrative about my declining relevance and approaching incapacity. Rereading it now, I realized how thoroughly I'd internalized their assessment of my worth. Instead of mailing that letter, I wrote a new one. Dear Lily, your grandfather learned something important this year. Getting older doesn't mean accepting other people's judgment about your value or your capacity. It means using the wisdom that comes from decades of experience to distinguish between people who genuinely care about your welfare and people who find it convenient to control your choices. You're 17 now, beginning to make decisions that will shape your entire life. Remember that Harold Whitman didn't build things designed to impress people. He built things designed to last. Build your life the same way. I sealed the letter and placed it in my desk. Not for mailing, but for keeping. A reminder that some battles are worth fighting, and some victories are worth savoring. December morning brought the kind of crisp clarity that makes reflection inevitable. I walked through rooms that had been battlefields 6 months ago, now restored to the comfortable familiarity Margaret and I had created over decades of marriage. Each space told stories, not of conflict and betrayal, but of the quieter satisfaction that comes from building a life designed to last. The guest bedrooms Eric and Monica had claimed as their temporary domain now served their original purposes, spaces for visitors who came by invitation rather than invasion, who respected boundaries rather than erasing them. I'd repainted the walls in colors Margaret had chosen, replaced fixtures Monica had updated with original hardware that matched the house's character. In what had been Monica's office, I found myself standing before the window that overlooked Mobile Bay, watching morning mist rise from water that had witnessed 81 years of my life. Childhood fishing trips with my father, teenage adventures with friends whose names I still remembered, courtship walks with Margaret along shorelines that seemed to stretch toward infinite possibilities. Professional achievements had been important. Hospitals that saved lives, schools that educated generations, bridges that connected communities. But standing in this room, I understood that legacy isn't just about structures that outlast their builders. It's about the people who carry forward what you taught them, who remember not just your work but your character, who honor your memory by becoming better versions of themselves. I opened the closet where Monica had stored boxes of old junk she'd cleared from shelves and tables during her redecorating campaign. Inside those boxes, photo albums spanning 5 decades of family history. Christmas mornings when Eric had been a wide-eyed child who believed in magic. Graduation ceremonies where he'd thanked me for always supporting my dreams. Wedding pictures where he'd promised to honor the example you and Mom set for loving marriage. The man who'd spoken those words bore little resemblance to the financial consired to steal my assets while claiming concern for my welfare. But looking at those photographs, I realized that Eric's betrayal didn't erase the genuinely happy memories we'd shared. It didn't invalidate the love I'd felt when he was a child who needed guidance, protection, encouragement. What it meant was that people change, sometimes in ways that disappoint you, sometimes in ways that require difficult decisions about boundaries and consequences. In another box, I found letters Margaret had written to me during the early years of our marriage, when engineering projects occasionally required extended travel. Her handwriting, careful, elegant, full of affection and practical observations about managing household details in my absence. but also full of insights about family relationships, financial planning, long-term goals that required careful consideration. One letter, dated 1998, discussed her concerns about Eric's financial habits. Harold, I love our son, but he's developing expensive tastes and unrealistic expectations about money. He assumes we'll always be able to help with whatever problems he creates. Maybe it's time to establish some boundaries, some consequences that teach him to solve problems independently. Margaret had seen warning signs 25 years ago that I'd missed or ignored. Her insistence on establishing the trust fund hadn't been general financial planning. It had been specific protection against Eric's tendency to view our assets as extensions of his own resources. Reading those letters, I felt the familiar presence of wisdom that had guided our marriage through 43 years of shared decisions. Margaret hadn't lived to witness Eric's ultimate betrayal, but she'd prepared defenses against exactly that kind of exploitation. Afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, my longtime physician, who'd heard through medical community networks about the cognitive impairment diagnosis that had triggered recent legal proceedings. Harold, she said, settling into the chair by my kitchen table, I wanted to apologize. Dr. Garrett contacted my office, requesting your medical records, claiming he was providing second opinion consultation at your family's request. I should have called you directly instead of simply forwarding the records. Patricia, you followed standard professional procedures. The problem wasn't with your actions, it was with people misrepresenting their intentions. Still, I feel partially responsible for what happened. Dr. Garrett's evaluation was clearly intended to produce a predetermined conclusion rather than genuine medical assessment. That kind of diagnostic manipulation is medical fraud, and I've reported him to the state medical board. Medical fraud, another layer of criminal behavior that would complicate Eric and Monica's attempts to rebuild their reputations in Baldwin County. That evening I found myself in Margaret's garden, now dormant for winter but showing signs of spring preparation, bulbs we'd planted together decades ago, perennials that returned each year regardless of weather or neglect, fruit trees we'd selected based on soil conditions and regional climate patterns. Everything designed to last, to produce beauty and nourishment long after the hands that planted them were no longer able to tend them. Margaret's approach to gardening had been the same as my approach to engineering. Careful planning, quality materials, maintenance schedules that prevented problems rather than reacting to crises. I sat on the stone bench I'd built beside her, rose bushes, and pulled out the digital recorder Lily had given me for my birthday, a gift I'd initially dismissed as unnecessary but now recognized as profoundly valuable. Lily, I said to the small device, your grandfather learned something important this year about the difference between inheritance and legacy. Inheritance is what people receive when you die. Money, property, possessions. Legacy is what people carry forward while you're still alive. Values, principles, examples of how to face difficulties with dignity and strength. I paused, watching sunset light paint the water gold, the same light that had witnessed 8 decades of my life in this place. Eric and Monica focused on inheritance, calculating the value of assets they assumed they'd eventually control. But legacy isn't something you can steal or manipulate or transfer through legal documents. Legacy is something you earn through how you treat people, how you handle responsibilities, how you respond when tested by difficult circumstances. The recording would join others I'd been making since the courthouse hearing, not bitter recollections of family betrayal, but thoughtful reflections on lessons learned through 8 decades of building, teaching, loving, losing, and ultimately prevailing against people who'd underestimated the strength that comes from knowing who you are and what you stand for. Later that evening, as I prepared for bed in the house I'd built with my own hands, I realized something that would have surprised the broken old man who'd sat in Margaret's sewing room 6 months ago. I wasn't angry anymore. Not with Eric for choosing theft over honesty. Not with Monica for choosing manipulation over respect. Not even with myself for taking so long to recognize what was happening. Instead, I felt the quiet satisfaction that comes from solving complex problems through careful analysis, methodical planning, and systematic execution. The same satisfaction I'd felt when signing blueprints for buildings that would outlast their designer, when mentoring apprentice engineers who'd carry forward professional standards, when teaching Sunday school children about the importance of keeping promises. Harold Whitman had built things designed to last, including his own character, and in the end, that had been enough. The invitation arrived on letterhead from the Fairhope Community Foundation, requesting my presence as honored guest at their annual Legacy Awards ceremony. Whitman, the letter read, your recent establishment of the Harold and Margaret Whitman Community Scholarship Fund represents the kind of forward-thinking philanthropy that builds stronger communities for future generations. We'd be honored if you'd share some thoughts about legacy and community service. Legacy and community service. 6 months ago, those words would have felt like distant concepts from a professional life that was over, a time when Harold Whitman's opinions mattered to people beyond his immediate family. Now they represented exactly what I'd fought, to preserve the right to determine my own legacy rather than accepting other people's dismissal of my continuing value. The ceremony was held at the Eastern Shore Art Center, a building I'd helped design 15 years ago when the community decided to convert a Depression-era school into a cultural showcase. Walking into that space felt like returning to professional recognition I'd almost forgotten I deserved, surrounded by evidence of work that had outlasted the people who'd questioned its relevance. The audience included faces I'd known for decades. Former clients, professional colleagues, church members, community leaders who remembered when Harold Whitman's signature on blueprints meant quality work completed on schedule and within budget. But also newer faces, younger professionals, recent retirees, civic organization members, who knew my reputation without knowing the personal struggles that had recently tested my resolve. Most importantly, Lily sat in the front row wearing a dress she'd chosen for the occasion, her expression radiating the pride granddaughters feel when their grandfathers receive public recognition for lifetime achievement. Beside her, Tom Hendricks and Billy Crawford represented the professional legacy that connected my engineering career to current construction projects throughout Baldwin County. When called to the podium, I carried with me the confidence that comes from knowing you've faced your worst fears and discovered they weren't fatal, that you've been tested by people who assumed age meant weakness and proven them wrong through systematic resistance rather than angry confrontation. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, looking out at an audience that had gathered to honor community service rather than witness family drama. 6 months ago, someone told me I had nothing left to offer, that my experience was outdated, my opinions irrelevant, my capacity for making meaningful decisions compromised by age and inevitable cognitive decline. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of Mobile Bay lapping against seawalls I'd helped design decades earlier. That someone was wrong, but not for the reasons you might expect. They were wrong because they confused having something to offer with having something people want to take from you. Legacy isn't about what you accumulate over a lifetime. It's about what you contribute while you're still capable of contributing. I gestured toward the scholarship fund announcement displayed on easels beside the podium. Margaret and I worked 43 years in this community, building structures that served families, training young engineers who carried forward professional standards, supporting institutions that made Baldwin County a better place to live and raise children. That work created assets, but more importantly, it created relationships based on mutual respect and shared commitment to quality. In the audience, I spotted faces that validated every word, former apprentices who'd become successful professionals, church members who remembered my years as deacon business associates, who trusted my structural analyses for projects involving millions of dollars and hundreds of lives. When family members tried to convince me that my age disqualified me from managing my own affairs, this community reminded me that Harold Whitman had earned respect through decades of reliable service. When legal challenges required evidence of my mental capacity, professional colleagues provided testimony based on years of working relationships. When I needed support for fighting back against exploitation, friends and neighbors rallied because they remembered who I'd been before anyone tried to convince me I was someone else. The scholarship fund represented more than financial assistance for engineering students. It represented proof that Harold Whitman still had something valuable to contribute, that his resources could serve purposes more meaningful than funding other people's lifestyle preferences or financial schemes. The scholarship fund will help young people pursue careers in structural engineering, continuing a tradition of building things designed to last. But more than that, it will remind them that professional integrity matters more than immediate profit, that community service creates legacies more valuable than individual wealth accumulation, that age brings wisdom worth preserving rather than obstacles worth eliminating. When I finished speaking, the applause felt different from polite appreciation elderly speakers usually receive. It felt like recognition, acknowledgement that Harold Whitman remained a valued community member whose opinions mattered, whose contributions were meaningful, whose presence enriched rather than burdened the institutions he'd served for decades. After the ceremony, people approached with conversations that would have seemed impossible 6 months ago. Billy Crawford discussed engineering consultation opportunities on upcoming commercial projects. Pastor Davidson invited me to consider returning to church leadership roles. Martha Stevens mentioned that the Historical Society needed someone with institutional memory to document construction history for the county's centennial celebration. Most significant was a conversation with District Attorney Rebecca Morrison, Judge Morrison's daughter, following family tradition in public service, who provided updates on the criminal case against Eric and Monica. Mr. Whitman, I wanted you to know that your willingness to pursue this case has encouraged 3 other elderly victims to report similar exploitation schemes. Financial abuse of elderly persons is more common than people realize, and successful prosecutions like yours create precedents that protect other families. Other elderly people who'd been told they had nothing left to offer, while their assets disappeared into unauthorized accounts, managed by people who claimed to love them. My decision to fight back had implications beyond personal vindication. As I drove home that evening, passing landmarks I'd helped design and construction projects, where I'd provided structural analysis, I realized that the ceremony had answered a question I'd been unconsciously asking for months. What happens to Harold Whitman after people try to steal everything he worked for and discover they can't? What happens is that Harold Whitman continues being Harold Whitman, community member, professional engineer, church deacon, neighbor who helps when help is needed, and speaks up when injustice threatens people who can't protect themselves. The next morning brought a letter forwarded through Judge Moorhead's office. Eric's handwriting. Several pages of what appeared to be genuine apology mixed with self-justifying explanation. He acknowledged that his actions had been wrong, claimed he'd been pressured by Monica's financial anxieties, expressed regret for damaging our relationship. The letter felt like too little, offered too late, from someone facing criminal prosecution for theft, rather than someone genuinely remorseful about betraying trust. But it confirmed something I'd suspected since the courthouse hearing. Eric understood that his actions had consequences extending far beyond family embarrassment. I filed the letter without responding, not from anger, but from recognition that some bridges can't be rebuilt simply because someone regrets burning them down. That afternoon, Lily visited with news that Eric and Monica were moving to Florida, seeking fresh starts in communities where their reputations hadn't been compromised by criminal charges and professional humiliation. She seemed conflicted about her parents' departure, relieved that family drama was ending, but sad about the fractured relationships that would probably never heal completely. Grandpa, do you think they'll ever really understand what they did wrong? Ida ordered a Weston. I considered the question while watching sunlight dance across Mobile Bay, the same light that had witnessed 8 decades of my life in this place I'd chosen, built, defended, and reclaimed. Lily, understanding requires acknowledging that other people have value beyond their usefulness to you. Your parents saw me as a source of assets they deserved to control, rather than a person whose lifetime of work had earned respect and autonomy. Until they can see elderly people, all people, as individuals with inherent dignity, rather than obstacles or opportunities, they won't understand what they did wrong. As evening approached, I sat in my leather recliner by the window overlooking the bay, reading engineering journals Billy Crawford had brought and planning consultation work that would keep my professional skills engaged with current construction challenges. At 81 years old, Harold Whitman still had something to offer, not because people wanted to take it from him, but because community members valued his expertise and experience. The phone rang with Tom Hendricks calling about breakfast plans for discussing a hospital expansion project that needed senior engineering consultation, professional work that mattered, compensation that reflected respect for expertise, relationships based on mutual trust rather than exploitation or manipulation. After the call, I returned to my chair and the familiar comfort of watching sunset light paint Mobile Bay gold, reflecting on words Monica had spoken at that long ago family barbecue. You've had your time. You've got nothing left to offer. Turns out I had something left, after all, just not for them. I had professional expertise that community members still valued enough to seek and compensate. I had financial resources that could support causes more meaningful than funding other people's lifestyle preferences. I had relationships with people who remembered my contributions and supported my right to determine my own legacy. Most importantly, I had the strength that comes from knowing who you are, what you stand for, and what you're willing to defend when people assume age means weakness. Harold Whitman had built things designed to last, including his own character, and in the end, that had been enough.